Welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture, guaranteed to spice up your relationship with God. I'm your host, Stephanie Roussel, and here is today's episode. Welcome to our bonus episode from Pathways to God's Presence. This is a YouTube-only episode, so if you've been listening on the podcast, I hope you're joining us to watch this special where I'm going to really walk you through all the books that have influenced Pathways to God's Presence. And these are some of my favorite books, some of which I highly recommend you read on a regular basis. And I might do that over the course of maybe the months to come, give you more of a reading list. I'm an avid reader, paper, but also Audible. Obviously, my husband is a huge Audible user, so really audiobooks are just really an awesome way. So I highly recommend all of the books here, and I'm just gonna go through them one at a time, spend maybe a minute on each one, and hopefully that's gonna maybe be your next birthday list, Christmas list from all the people you love. And we're gonna have links where you can purchase those through Amazon, and it's through the charity, the Gospel Spice charity. So it's an affiliate link, and we make, I think, 1% of the sale or something like that. Not sure on the number, but very small an amount, and it's completely free for you, and it allows us to function just a little bit more. So the first one is a classic, Pilgrim's Progress. I have the privilege of having found an edition that's over 100 years old. I found that at a book fair, and I think I paid the hefty sum of like $2 for it. And I absolutely love it. Mine is full of like original illustration. It's a work of art. It has just beautiful, it's just so precious. I love it. I honestly don't actually read that particular edition specifically. So it says 1901. So it's kind of an old book. I love it. It's on my shelf of favorite books. I actually read it on my Kindle or on my computer, and I do have like a cheap paperback version. But Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. You absolutely need to know this classic and read it. I would say maybe every 2 to 3 years is a good idea. It's a decently quick read. It's very easy, especially if you read an updated English. And honestly, it is so beautiful. It is full of striking illustrations, and it's the story of a believer, Christian, and he's on his way to the celestial city. And this is the story of his sanctification. And he is on a path, and he meets all sorts of people, and he gets captured by giants in castles, and he falls in ditches, and he is betrayed by himself, by others, and he is led by the Lord. And at the end, he makes it to the celestial city, which is heaven. And it is it's an unmatched classic. It inspired The Lord of the Rings. It inspired The Chronicles of Narnia, which are my 2 favorite fiction books ever. But John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, really, really good stuff. So you absolutely want to read this one, and maybe study it a bit. If you find online good resources that help you understand all of the Christian metaphors that are used in there, because they're powerful. Pilgrim's Progress, absolute must read. But that's not all. I have a lot more books for you. This one is a very humble little book. And this is quite marked because my husband and I really like it. It is such a simple, underwhelming title. It's called The Christian's Secret of a Happy Life. And it is written by a Quaker woman, Hannah Whitall Smith. She wrote this in 1875, I believe. Let me check. 1875. It has sold millions of copies. The Christian Secret of a Happy Life. It is so simple, and it is so profound. I highly recommend The Christians. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it is absolutely a little treasure. The Christian Secret to a Happy Life. My husband loves it on audiobook. Highly recommend this one. She is full of common sense. She's a no-nonsense kind of girl, nothing fancy about her. She actually was from Philadelphia. We kind of researched her a little bit, and she was an influential person in the late 1800s. So super cool. Next one, Habits of Grace by David Mathis. Now, Habits of Grace is a very different kind of book. It is, I would say, the easiest book on the spiritual disciplines on the market that I know of. It's a recent book, maybe 10 years ago, 2016. So a few years ago. And David Mathis works for Desiring God with John Piper. And so it's very deep, but it's also shockingly simple. And he basically summarizes all of the spiritual disciplines in 3 categories. So the spiritual disciplines we've been studying, he summarizes them as hearing God's voice, which means studying his word, having God's ear, which is a way of saying prayer, and belonging to God's body, which is fellowship. And that's how he uses all of the spiritual disciplines through that format. There's a workbook that goes with this. I don't recommend the workbook. It didn't do much for me, but this is a little gem of a book. It's super easy to do. And again, this is a book that Gospel Spice has used to disciple people in the past. So really, really cool book. Super easy, great to do as a small group. Habits of Grace by David Mathis. Actually, it's interesting. I'm going to switch to 2 books that are at the bottom of my pile here. David Mathis explains that if you want more, and that was so interesting to me. I was reading this for the first time a few years ago, and he recommended 2 books as the primary sources, 2 books I had literally just finished reading, and it's those 2. So this is a bit of a Reader's Digest of these 2 volumes, which are phenomenal. If you want one book on the spiritual disciplines, well, there's 2 that I equally recommend, but one of the 2 books is The Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life by Donald Whitney. Let me say that again, The Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life by Donald Whitney. This copy is completely marked. I have read it, I don't know how many times. It's earmarked, it's written all over, because this is the most accessible and yet comprehensive book on the spiritual disciplines for the everyday person like you and me. It's not scholarly, it's not academic, but it's not baby either. Like it's challenging, but in a very accessible way. So Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life. Truly, honestly, this is my go-to resource. With the other one, I'll share a bit later. And he spends a lot of time. That's how I got the word Bible intake. By the way, he talks about Bible intake. That's the first spiritual disciplines. He has several chapters on that. Prayer, worship, evangelism, serving, stewardship, fasting, silence and solitude, journaling, learning, persevering in the discipline. So you might hear a lot of the language I've used throughout Pathways to God's Presence, because I've read this book so many times. It has just really inspired the series. Actually, I purposefully did not reread it just before I wrote the series, because I knew I was already steeping in it so much. I didn't want it to come out like I was just kind of rehashing what he was saying. But this is really good stuff. Donald Whitney, Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life. It's not an easy read because it's a slow read. For me, like, it's the kind of book you read a paragraph or 2 and then you ponder it. Really good stuff. Good stuff. The other book that David Mathis was referring had just come out at the time, and it's by our beloved Timothy Keller, and it's his book called Prayer. So this one is obviously just about prayer. It's not about the other spiritual disciplines. Prayer by Tim Keller. A gem, like pure treasure. You absolutely want to read this book if you want to dive into the spirit of prayer. What's interesting is that I recently heard an interview by Tim Keller that Tim Keller gave on a podcast. And he wrote this in 2014, and he gave the interview in 2023, so 9 years later. And he says that through his recent cancer journey, and I'm recording this in February of 2023, so he is battling pancreatic cancer, and he's saying how it has absolutely transformed his prayer life. And I suspect that a lot of the things he teaches in this book, he would probably teach at a much deeper level now. So, and I have no idea what that level would be. Like, I'm a baby when it comes to prayer, especially compared to giants like Tim Keller and others. So, but Timothy Keller, Prayer, absolutely inevitable book if you're interested in learning more about prayer. Highly recommend it. And since I'm talking about the books that really truly influenced me the most, there's a few others here that I've read once and that I recommend, but these are the ones that are like, you want to read those on a regular basis. The last one in the series of those that I recommend for you to read regularly, and I've mentioned it in the series, it's Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline. Now, that is dynamite. I couldn't tell you between Donald Whitney and Richard Foster which one's my favorite. Both of them are equally essential. They cater to the same topic of the spiritual discipline, but their approach is very different. Complementary is how I would put it. So you want Donald Whitney and you want Richard Foster. Actually, February of 2023, as I'm recording this, I will have Richard Foster on the Gospel Spice podcast in April of 2023 for his new book, Learning Humility, which is a little bit gem of a book, but I don't have it here with me. I'll be discussing it with him. And that interview will be available on the YouTube channel starting in April 2023. We're recording in February. But Celebration of Discipline is 40 years old. I think it was published in the late 1970s, I believe, 1978, unless I'm mistaken. I believe I should have to check that, 1978. This is a book that you want to read, I mean, honestly, ideally every year. Maybe that's not realistic, so alternate. Maybe this odd years, even years, or vice versa. Truly a life-changing book when it comes to the spiritual disciplines, if you're serious about it. His format is very simple, but again, it's one of those where I read one chapter at a time, but I've read it so many times I cannot know what's coming, but one chapter at a time. There's 13 chapters. He has a very different approach from David Mathis, Habits of Grace. He has 3 categories for the spiritual disciplines. He has the inward disciplines, and he'll explain to you what that means, and namely meditation, prayer, fasting, and study. These are the inward discipline because they transform the inner man or woman. And then part 2 is the outward disciplines, because they're the ones that have, they are more the outward manifestation of an inward transformation. And in there, he quotes simplicity, solitude, submission, and service. And then finally, the corporate disciplines, which is a little bit like the body and the fellowship of David Mathis. And there we have confession, worship, guidance, and celebration. And it's interesting because it's titled Celebration of Discipline. And he links that very well in the final chapter of the book on celebration, the celebration of discipline and the discipline of celebration. It's beautifully written, very inspiring. My favorite chapter in all of this, I'd be hard pressed to pick one, but fasting, the one on fasting is very good. But all of them really are. I mean, you can't not read those books, truly. So that's like the gold list right here. So let me go through them again one more time, and then I'll give you some additional optional, maybe less essential, at least in my humble, very biased and subjective experience. But these are the books that have carried me through the last two decades, maybe. Pilgrim's Progress. I know all of these again, like every year, every 2 years, as often as you can. Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster, which again is the twin and complement to the Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life by Donald Whitney. And they're summed up in David Mathis' Habits of Grace. And more specifically on prayer, you have Tim Keller's Prayer. And last but not least, because she sums everything up together beautifully in very simple, clear, very accessible, and yet so profound ways, The Christian Secret of a Happy Life by Hannah Whitall Smith. Okay, that's your go-to list. This is your Christmas shopping list, maybe. And then a few more that are, that I mean, kind of really good, but not like you want to read those every year kind of list. Prayers in the Night by Tish Harrison Warren, and then Liturgy of the Ordinary by the same author. Tish Harrison Warren writes really good books about prayer. And so Prayer in the Night is about praying when you can't sleep, for those who work or watch or weep. And so it's prayers in the middle of the night because you're working, because you're watching, because you're weeping. And so she's developing ways to trust God in the dark. So really good book about prayer. Okay. Liturgy of the Ordinary, Spiritual Disciplines in the Middle of Peanut Butter Sandwiches, Kind of Life. Very fun, cute, sweet little book. Very Anne Voskamp-like. I really like Tish Harrison Warren for that. This is actually a really good gift book. Awesome book to give to busy moms with little kids, to people who want to dip their toe into a more spiritual pathway, really pathways to God's presence in the ordinary. So Liturgy of the Ordinary, this is a bestseller. This is a really, really good book. Really good book. Awesome gift to people. And then the last two, Jerry Bridges' Practice of Godliness. So this one isn't actually spiritual disciplines. It's more discovering your spiritual gifts and how to use them. I've mentioned the spiritual gifts, and I think in last week's episode, the last one in the series 7, I mentioned it's important for you to find your spiritual gifts. And this is a book to do that and to develop them. And again, I have highlighted that. And so it's about, did I say spiritual gifts? I think I just made a mistake. It's not the spiritual gifts and discovering your spiritual gifts. Just scratch that. That's going to be on video, and that can be a blooper in the future. I'm tired. I'm sorry. It's late at night as I'm recording this. This is not the spiritual gifts. This is about practicing godliness. I was thinking of the wrong book. And it's about fruit. Spiritual fruit, not the fruit of the Spirit per se, but basically the characteristics of a godly life, how to develop godliness. And so we talk about devotion to God, about humility, contentment, thankfulness, joy, holiness, self-control, faithfulness, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, goodness, love. So fruit of the Spirit, but in the sense of practicing godliness. And so it really has a lot to do with the spiritual disciplines, but it's not a book about the spiritual disciplines. It's a book about the fruit of the Spirit through the practice of godliness. And I think Donald Whitney mentions that book a few times. So this is a good one. Jerry Bridges' Practice of Godliness. The last one is more of an add-on suggestion. It's a friend of mine who gave it to me for this study, and it's called The Rest of God by Mark Buchanan, and it has to do with Sabbath. And there's some parts in this that I was not too fond of. I think sometimes the author comes across not quite as humble, maybe, as, gosh, and I'm saying this on the record, but as you might want him to. But if you don't let that bother you, the stuff he writes is actually really good. So really good content. It's really going to get you thinking about Sabbath and rest from a godly perspective. So get past maybe a bit of the style, especially in the early chapters, and then you will find some very interesting practices and strategies that you might want to try. So this one I do not recommend as much as I do my big pile here. So this is the absolute, you want to read those. And these are more optional, and this is the most optional of them all. The Rest of God. But it's going to get you thinking. This is going to get you thinking in unusual ways. But I don't recommend as much as I do that pile. So that's it. That's your Christmas shopping list is now done, thanks to Gospel Spice. And you have all of the things that I recommend you read. I would love to hear your comments, especially if you already are familiar with any one of those books. What do you think about it? Please comment below, because it's going to help all of us. And if you have any recommendations of books, could you please comment just below? Because I want to hear, I want to learn from you. I want to read the books you are reading. So please tell me what you are reading, and tell all of us what you're reading along the lines of the spiritual disciplines. And pick up those books on Amazon, and you will have the links in order to do that as well. So thank you so much. This is the end to our Pathways to God's Presence series, and I will see you again next week right here on Gospel Spice.
And now, a brief message from Gospel Spice.
Did you know that Gospel Spice has a library of in-depth Bible studies available online for free? Discover our previous podcast studies on your own or with friends, and enjoy exclusive content that includes listening guides for each teaching episode, study questions, verses to memorize, tips, and more. Just visit gospelspice.com and click on the Studies tab. Now back to the podcast.
Now, back to the video.
Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Merci. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and click that bell icon so you are the first to know when we release a new video or episode. Also, would you please consider helping us reach new people with the good news of the spice of the gospel by leaving a 5-star review for the Gospel Spice podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Google, etc. Finally, share and follow us on social media to spread the word of Gospel Spice. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to tune in our podcast with new episodes every Friday. I'll see you in our next video very soon, right here. Merci.